Hi everyone who's joined us. I'll just wait for a few more seconds and you're slowly trickling in before I do a quick introduction and then I'll hand over to Rachel. Hope you're all enjoying some spring sunshine wherever you are. It's quite sunny here in Somerset, so I feel quite lucky, but I've heard it's quite grey and drizzly in other parts of the country. Right. Well, this will be recorded, so if anyone wants to desperately hear my very interesting and riveting introduction, then you can go back and listen to it for those who aren't here. But I will begin because time is of the essence. Thank you all for coming tonight. This is the second part of the webinar done by Rachel on urban organic food production. We had the first one about 3 weeks ago. It was really amazing to hear a lot of the work that Rachel's done and research into urban and peri-urban food growing projects around the world. I was really inspired personally, and I think everyone who joined us also got a lot of inspiration, and hopefully were motivated to kind of take away the lessons and start something or talk to their friends or something. So thank you for that, Rachel. This is the second part, and I'll leave Rachel to do most of the introduction, but it's more of a kind of deep dive into some of the examples I think that she gave, and yes, looking at some case studies. Just to give a little bit of background for those who don't know who the Organic Growers Alliance are, we are a small membership-based organisation working in the UK for growers. We're run by growers, and we are the voice of organic horticulture. So we provide practical resources through the means of a podcast, webinars like this one, the Organic Grower magazine, which comes out quarterly, and loads of other stuff that you can get your hands on. You can become a member. If you're not already a member, then I'd love you to join. We'd all love you to join. And yeah, you can also get free tickets to our webinars if you're a member, and discounted tickets to our other events. So you can just join on our website. And if anyone has any suggestions for other webinars that they'd like to see, or that they'd like us to do, then you can shoot me a message. I'll put my email in the chat. Yeah, we try and do them every month or every 2 months, really focusing on kind of practical aspects of organic growing. So send me some suggestions and we can get that sorted for you, hopefully. A little bit of housekeeping before I hand over to Rachel. This is being recorded, like I said, so we'll put it up on our YouTube channel afterwards, and you can share it and send it to friends. The talk, I think, Rachel, is going to be about an hour long, and then maybe like half an hour for questions, with time to kind of run over if you want to. So do make sure that you ask your questions in the Q&A box down below. This is a webinar style thing rather than a Zoom meeting, so you can store all the questions in the Q&A. Rachel can keep an eye on those, and maybe if they're relevant to what she's talking about at that point, she'll answer them. Any questions, put in the chat. I'll try and forward them over to the question and answer box, but if you can just be aware that they might not be caught if you put them in the chat. And also feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat to each other, say where you're from, where you grow. It'd be nice to see who's here tonight, and hear about your experience in growing. So without further ado, I will hand over to Rachel. Thank you very much, Rachel. Oh, and also, no, I said this is being recorded. Cool. Over to you.
Definitely being recorded, just to make that clear. Hi everyone. Thanks for the intro, Lizzie. So I'll just do a brief introduction to myself and why I'm talking about the topic I'm doing, and then I'll introduce the topic. For those of you that were here for the part 1 of urban food production, there won't be too much duplication, so don't worry about that. I'll do a kind of brief recap and an intro at the beginning. But if you didn't see part 1, it's not like you won't get it. And obviously you can go to the OGA and watch the first part at your leisure. Yeah, so my name's Rachel. I'm a landscape architect and an urban designer. I've been growing food all my life, always organically, never had to sort of, be persuaded. I've been growing professionally, I guess, for the last sort of 10-ish plus years. I found myself living in Todmorden, where Incredible Edible started, and was lucky enough to be involved in that project quite a few years ago. And seeing the impact that had on that town was so moving and exciting and inspiring. So when I moved back to Oxford, I set up Incredible Edible Oxford, which is now my business called Edge. So we basically became Edge because the level of work we were doing wasn't fit for a community organisation or really an Incredible Edible group. So we needed to kind of just formalise the business a bit. But we run as not-for-profit. As you can see in the logo behind me, our activities based around design, grow and education. And we run workshops face-to-face and online. We advise market gardens in their setup and their expansions or efficiencies, I guess is probably a more appropriate word. I describe myself as regen food production grower because for me it's sort of organic plus, so it's always without chemicals anyway, but also then no dig and focusing on soil health. So I guess that's kind of our part of our USP. And then we do, through my design background, we do sort of assisting landscape professionals if they're incorporating food or biodiversity within a scheme, so a housing estate or a school, a hotel, a business park, etc. So for me, the exciting part of food growing is unusual edibles and nice and exciting different things, and also showing people that it is possible to make money from growing food. But for me, the challenge is around urban food production. Because it's fine to have an acre, 5 acres, 10 acres, wherever, if you're lucky enough to have that. But there are many people that are not lucky enough to have that and will never be able to have that, either because they can't afford it or because there's no land available. And so we have many towns and cities where we have a high density of population with lots of mouths to feed. And so I guess a few years ago, I just got quite interested in what could that look like, if we started to really think about designing our cities for food production. So I guess one of my areas of interest is certainly around urban food production. So that's kind of an intro, and I'm just going to share my slides, which hopefully will work, and hopefully someone will tell me if it does or it doesn't work. So you should be seeing a slide that says urban food production part 2.
Yeah.
Great.
Good.
Thanks, Lizzie. Okay. So I'm going to put this slide up first. It's a lot, so I'll give you a few moments to take it in. But really, just to recap, either for people that were here last time or people new to it, where I see the benefits of urban food production sitting. And as you can see, there are many. And there are huge benefits around health, which is why there's so many there. Obviously, environmental qualities as well. But for me, where I get quite excited is around the economy of it, and the educational side of it. And for anyone that knows Incredible Edible, they know that it's based on the idea that you have 3 spinning plates and you keep these plates spinning, which are business, community and education. And so for me, I guess I use more the words of social, economic and environmental, but the sort of the money side of it, whilst I'm not suggesting that we all become capitalists, actually it is really important to be able to make a livelihood. We all need money, unfortunately. And so the economic side of food growing and urban food production for me is quite exciting. And I think Todmorden have done a number of really great things that have shown that food growing in a town can be really powerful and really effective towards an economy. Anyway, so I've just kind of talked to give you a chance to look over that really. In terms of possible yields, we're all growers, I would imagine, or at least an interest in growing here tonight. So I don't need to kind of try and teach you what possible yields there could be. But this is my list basically. So I'm not suggesting it's exhaustive. But for me, you know, very, very plant-based, but incorporating some livestock as well, because it's really useful for the manure and kind of manured bedding. Yeah, no desire to offend anyone here tonight. If you're vegan or whatever, you know, all systems can be designed for a vegan system. But I will be talking about, you know, small scale, sort of some livestock. So I've put birds in mainly for egg production, but of course all of those listed there could be eaten as well. Rabbits, so I mean in the war during Dig for Victory, rabbits were produced a lot for meat. It's actually a really nutritious meat. They don't need loads of space. Again, when I'm talking about any kind of livestock or keeping any kind of creature, it's always with optimum and maximum welfare standards. I'd never look at anything industrial or battery or anything like that. So always kind of thinking about the welfare of the animal. But rabbits don't need loads of space, and we know that they breed really quickly and voraciously. So that, you know, there are a number of advantages there, but I won't dwell on that too much. Tea and coffee alternatives. So of course, growing herbs for teas, you know, you sort of standard mints and lemon verbenas and things like that. But there are some more unusual ones. Also, if you have a polytunnel, probably you can grow the Camellia sinensis, which is the black tea plant. Coffee, a number of coffee alternatives. Not suggesting we can grow the coffee bean itself, but actually, I was just saying to Lizzie, I enjoyed a cup of acorn coffee today, which I made myself. So that's something that I make every year, and acorns could be incredibly valuable for us going forward, because you can make a flour from acorns as well as a coffee, and it doesn't have the same structure as wheat, but mixed with wheat, it would make a very decent flour for breads and pastas and things like that. So, you know, maybe something like a 50-50 acorn and wheat mix would give it enough of the structure. But imagine if we could reduce our wheat production by 50%. I mean, that's amazing and great for soils, because we could do more, you know, sort of agroecological systems where the wheat's otherwise been. You know, yeah, great for sort of diverse farming. And you know, energy use in terms of farming huge amounts of arable. So it would potentially free up a whole load of land. Anyway, so I guess those are sort of the main yields that I'm looking at when I'm talking about urban food production. So the things I'm not including is arable crops and probably dairy, so cattle, sheep, probably pigs, and dairy, cows for milk, because of the land area needed, really. So, but I think everything else is potentially on the cards for urban food production. I mentioned last time we've created a toolkit, and that's just a picture of it. But the reason I did this was because through my studies of urban design and landscape architecture, I was finding that even though these were the landscape professionals of the future, and I was slightly older, so I was, you know, a lot of people were younger than me and going into their full career, just knew nothing about integrating food into a landscape or even actually biodiverse planting. It's changing a bit. I lecture at Oxford Brookes, and I know that there are, you know, some things that are happening and being included now, but certainly it was my experience that people weren't really being taught that. So the reason why I created this was to assist people that are responsible for designing our landscapes to think about how we can start to incorporate more food. And there are a number of supporting systems within that, you know, that to support food production. So, for example, compost, it doesn't directly produce food necessarily. Could potentially grow some squash or something on the heat, but they are supporting systems. So, yeah, really thinking about kind of how we can start to incorporate that more into our urban environment. And this is kind of what they look like. So I've got 34 different food production systems in there, and it includes things like years to full yield, quantity of yield in kilograms, what that system can save. And then at the bottom, we've got environmental, social and economic benefits of that particular system. So I've tried to include very useful and pertinent information so that people can assess different food production systems against each other. And so I guess I'm using kind of some of those ideas from the cards to present to you tonight. And when we're talking about urban food production, one of the key questions I get asked and that needs addressing is, how is that landscape being managed? Of course, the standard way that landscapes get managed is with local authority involvement, highways and byways, etc. They'll mow verges, they'll mow in parks, they'll keep hedges tidy because that's what everybody seems to want, most people anyway. Yeah, manage things like ornamental beds in parks and things like that. So traditionally, that's been local authority. But we all know that local authorities are really struggling for funding and the money that they get. So I know that in Oxford, for example, most places were cut down to one cut last summer, which is a huge shift, you know, absolute huge shift, when normally it's something like, I don't know, 30, 40, I don't know the exact number, but, you know, a lot during the year. So I think things are moving in the right direction in terms of sort of managing landscapes in a more biodiverse friendly way. But how else could we manage landscapes if we were growing food in them? It's really important because if it's not the local authority, then someone has to have responsibility for that. Someone has to hold the insurance for that, and someone needs to be responsible for keeping that place you know, compliant with health and safety, boring, but necessary. Somebody has to be ultimately responsible for making sure that that site is managed. And if it's food, you know, we need to make sure that we're harvesting it. So where does that crop go? How does it get distributed? How does it reach the end user? Rather than, you know, all the apples that we see falling to the ground on the side of motorways and roads that don't get harvested and just rot, basically, and other crops too. So I've done this kind of brief summary of some of the options. You know, there's obviously the incredible edible option of help yourself. So that's kind of not monetized, but it's free for people to help themselves too. And generally that's managed with volunteers. There are, you know, various community groups and volunteer groups that one could join or set up. So things like green gyms, was called BTCV volunteers, community payback, which is what community service used to be called. So organised groups of offenders that have you know, are on day release or coming out of prison and can work the landscape. Private enterprise. So yeah, a couple of people, group of people setting up and running some kind of private enterprise, using the land and managing it. Some kind of charity. So Aspire is an example that I use in Oxfordshire, which so they train ex-offenders, recovering addicts, etc., in landscape management, and then take on contracts for landscape management, which I think is a really interesting model. And then Old People's Home for 4-year-olds was a really beautiful programme on Channel 4, and it was about pairing really young people, so nursery age children, with older people that were in care, and just seeing what happened with those relationships really, and the benefit of health, particularly to the older people. You know, we really don't value old people in this country as well as we should, and as well as happens in other cultures. And I think it's such a missed opportunity because there's so much value there, and they learn from each other. You know, it's so important. So there's a number of potential models. This isn't an exhaustive list, but it's potentially some ideas around kind of, you know, what is an alternative to local authority. And then, of course, we need to distribute that. So I won't go through all of those, they're fairly self-explanatory, but we need to make sure that that food is entering the local food system, is creating a value, is earning a livelihood for the grower, and it is being consumed and used, you know, to its full extent, and we're reducing waste. So last time I talked about building scale, and I looked at plot scale, and today I'm going to continue talking about streets, and we looked at a few from streets, but I'm going to carry on now. So we looked at hedgerows and raised beds and rain gardens last time as a summary, and tonight I'm going to carry on talking about streets. Okay, so silviculture is essentially trees. So the silvy bit is the trees bit. So it's the culture of trees, and there are many examples of where edible and productive trees are used in the urban environment, and I've put a couple of examples on here. So we've got citrus in Athens, and we've got a strawberry tree here in the UK. Although the strawberry tree technically is from Spain, so it's not native to here. But that picture is from the UK. But I think they're beautiful trees. They produce a fruit that in Spain is turned into a spirit called Madrono, and it's an evergreen. It has a really long flowering period, so it's great for pollinators. And I just really love that structure of those branches, and I think, you know, structurally it really adds something to a landscape. And then of course you've got citrus trees, which in the hotter climes is entirely possible. And you can see why now I was saying about, you know, the processes for harvesting, because what you don't want is all that fruit or nut or whatever is coming from the tree just to fall on the ground and get wasted. So there needs to be a system, but there are many places and examples of where that's happening. So it's just about managing that in the right way, really. So a couple of real life examples. So in Ottawa in Canada, they have deliberately started planting edible trees around the urban landscape with the intention of that crop going into food banks. And I just think that's such a great idea, because, you know, we all need to have access to fresh fruit and veg, and it's a great use of the urban landscape to think about, you know, people that maybe aren't getting access to that fresh produce in other ways. So that's one recent example. So I think, you know, just to summarize on street trees, you know, there's a number of different things that we could be doing. We could be looking at fruits and nuts. We could be looking at leaf production. And I guess now might be a good place to tackle the what about pollution from cars question, which I usually get asked. So I guess what I said last time is I'm not usually talking to an all organic audience. So usually my answer is, unless you eat entirely organic food, you will be consuming far worse. But of course, that doesn't really work in this particular setting. But yeah, non-organic food, as we all know, is sprayed and sprayed and sprayed, and you know, has a lot of toxins on it that we are consuming and putting into our bodies. So in my humble opinion, food that's grown on a street side is frankly no worse than a non-organic crop. Obviously, that's down to your own sort of opinion and choice, and I certainly wouldn't force anyone to eat anything that's been grown on the street. But we also know that crops are managed with machinery, so there's fumes coming out of an exhaust that's going around crops, managing that, whether it's a small tractor or a massive combine. You know, there are machines used heavily in most food production, apart from very, very small scale, which is another advantage for urban food production, because often it's in much smaller spaces. Often it's on something like a rooftop, somewhere where you wouldn't be able to get a tractor anyway. So actually urban food production can be great for a smaller carbon footprint, really, in production. Yeah, so just to tackle that, really. So I guess, yeah, often I get asked, do you think it's safe to grow food next to streets where there's traffic? So hopefully that helps tackle that. It's my opinion, and obviously you have your own opinion and decide what you're comfortable with. But yeah, personally, I think there's a case for it. And it makes the streets look great. It gives people something to get involved in, and to be active. Okay, so that concludes the street section. And as I say, if you didn't catch the last bit, you'll be able to see the other sort of areas of growth, from buildings right up to streets. So the next layer, if you like, so if anyone here is into urban design, it's arranged around the morphological layers, is what it's called. And so we're going from kind of really small buildings right up to the larger. And now I'm going to talk to you about the green and blue infrastructure. Okay. So orchards. Yeah, we're seeing quite a few orchards now sitting in parks, and other green spaces. And I guess it's a really nice additional use of something like a park, because it's another function of it. It can be a really nice social space. And you know, obviously you're creating then a yield as well that can be used either to process into juice or you know, as fresh produce. I guess the only thing I'd like to say about it is we always grow in polyculture. And the only issue, if I was ever to have an issue with orchards, is that they are often, or traditionally, should I say, very, very monoculture. So not only just one fruit, but often the same variety of fruit even. So they just become a very vulnerable system to any kind of pest or disease. And also they're not really helping the soil health, because there's no diverse fruits there. Even though you've got, you know, nice deep tree roots. So for us, an orchard would be very polyculture, and we'd incorporate a lot of different varieties into it. Also, just to say about apples, so I don't know if people know the statistic, but I mentioned about apples before, but 90,000 tonnes of apples go to waste in the UK every year. So as part of our work, we always try and dissuade people from planting apple trees. You know, and again, that's just my opinion, but it's just heartbreaking to think of all of that good food going to waste. You know, so thinking about other distribution routes for the apples that are currently going to waste. And I guess, you know, that's a mixture of, you know, apples that fall from the tree and don't get harvested, apples that get rejected by supermarkets because they're the wrong size, shape, colour, wonky veg and fruit, apples that get bought but then not consumed and thrown out of the fridge. So, you know, I'm sure there's a number of different contributing factors to that. But yeah, I believe it's the third most wasted food in this country. So behind potatoes and bread. If you're interested, that's just the geek in me. So in terms of orchards, we wouldn't spec apples personally, but I've got an example later, which is quite a fun kind of orchard plus case study. So I'll show you that a bit later on. And if we wanted to go a step beyond orchards, one way that we can do that is incorporate animals. So it's called silver pasture. It sits under agroforestry as a agroecological system. And you know, what we see traditionally on farms is we'll see an orchard, and in the field next door we'll see sheep or cows or another animal, chickens, whatever. But what we could do is we could combine those two systems, and there are a number of benefits there, because the animals get shade. So we always incorporate trees into any kind of livestock system because of the benefits that can bring. So some shading, so it creates a warmer space in winter and a cooler space in summer. And you know, who knows what's going to be happening with all of our temperatures and extreme weathers. Providing scratching posts, providing forage, leaf litter, additional biodiversity benefits, and you know, adding resilience to the animals. And something that is not used nowadays but has traditionally been used by previous our ancestors is tree hay. And tree hay, you know, is basically harvesting from trees to provide hay for animals over winter, which is a much more efficient way of feeding animals over winter than, you know, putting aside a meadow and producing hay that's then baled up. So yeah, a number of benefits to that system, and I really like it. It feels really nice to have trees in a livestock system. So silver pasture is one of my personal favourites. And of course, you could have birds under grazing as well. It doesn't have to be something like sheep or cows that are larger. It could be an integrated bird system. If you don't have the space for something like an orchard or silver pasture, then tree guild is a step beyond orchard, but it can be done on a much smaller scale. So a tree guild is essentially a collection of plants that sits around a tree. So quite often you'll see kind of circular diagrams of a tree guild where you've got kind of outwardly going circles of crop from around the tree, but it doesn't have to be arranged like that. It's I guess, a step towards forest garden, and I'm going to talk about that one in a minute. But tree guild could just be one tree that has underplanting, so shrubs, climbers, herbaceous, ground cover plants, potentially root crops, all around one tree. So if you think about the size of a tree, of course, it depends what that tree is, whether it's a sweet chestnut, which is huge, or a dwarf fruit tree, which is much smaller. But it's something that can be replicated and put into much smaller spaces. So it doesn't require as much space as something like an orchard or a forest garden. And this is an example of one of the tree guilds in our forest garden in Oxford. So this is in a public park in Oxford. And yeah, just to show really what that could look like, it's just one example. So we've got a fruit tree in the centre, and then we've got fruit bushes around it. And in this design, we put a black, a red, a white currant and a josterberry around each tree that we planted. And then you can see there's underplanting there of herbs and some rhubarb. And then we use things like mints as ground cover, because for anyone that knows the weed, we've got silverweed that grows viciously there, and you can see that just in the foreground. And then we just, as an example, surrounded this one with some hazel weave, just to kind of section it off. Also, you know, it's a park, so to stop kind of footballs flying in and it getting trampled over. I have to say though, this forest garden has received next to no vandalism. I think we've had 2 branches snapped off trees, but apart from that, yeah, nothing, and it's completely public. And then in the background, you can just see some hazel. And what we found is that hazel is incredibly effective at absorbing groundwater. So, I mean, you know, they like wet feet. I'm sure a lot of you know that anyway. But in terms of managing a landscape, what we found is that this site used to be underwater every winter, about a couple of foot of water, and now it's not. And I visited, when would it have been? March, I think, when we were really, you know, still in that really wet patch. And this area had no surface water, but the area directly behind it, so kind of from where the picture's taken, is just an area of grass behind the forest garden, and that was under 2 foot of water. So yeah, just to show really how effective plants and trees can be at managing groundwater, but particularly hazel. So that's usually one of our top tips. Okay. And this is the forest garden that I've just been talking about on planting day. So that's me in the middle. And we did it as part of a PDC that we were running at the time. So we had a good amount of helpers already, but also people that were walking past in the park were stopping and saying, "Can I help? This looks great." So it's a great community engagement tool. And this was back in 2017. So this year the garden will be 7 years, and I would say it probably took about 3 years to get fully established, but that's quite quick in the world of growing, in my opinion. So you can see how small the plants were when they went in. You know, the hazels were whips, etc. And this was it about 3.5 years later. So you can see how tall the hazels got. So this is the other end of the garden. And this is where people come into the park. So it's one of the first things that they see on that particular entrance. We've got some signage up that just explains what the garden is, what it's doing, why it's there. You know, and it was part of our sort of original Incredible Edible aims that we wanted to educate people around food production, to show people what plants look like, you know, what particular plants look like. and people can just help themselves from that. So in the summer when there's berries, we see lots of, you know, parents and children and different groups coming and using it and harvesting, which is lovely. Of course, there is the risk of dogweed. So anything that we harvest is always, you know, and we advise people to harvest sort of from dogweed height upwards, because that's not very pleasant. But yeah, it's really effective. It's nice as a social space, and a forest garden doesn't have to be huge in area, and you know, can provide a number of different benefits. So this one was not predominantly planted for commercial food production. It's part of our kind of social aims, I guess, and we run sort of volunteer sessions and things like that on it. So I like to use other examples of things from other people that isn't just stuff that we've done. And this is Birchfield Forest Garden, which is again in a public park in Manchester, and a really nice example because it's much bigger than the one that we've got in Oxford, and it's older as well, so it's more established. So if you ever find yourself in Manchester, go and check it out. It's in the public park. And just to give you some scale, I don't know if you can see, but in the sort of bottom right of the circle of the forest garden, there's a park bench. So that gives you some idea of the scale. It's a huge area, and then divided into 4 subsections of different forest garden. It's a mix of fruit and nut trees, and underplanting. And again, that's managed with the volunteer model. Couple of nice examples. If you're at the last one, you would have seen the one on the left, which is in Reading, and that's a rooftop forest garden. And just in the forefront there's a strawberry tree. So just to show you another strawberry tree, one of my favourites, and that's all on a foot of soil, and that was planted as part of a flood alleviation sort of strategy for a flat roof, because the roof was leaking and they had to do repairs anyway, so they decided to reinforce it enough to take a garden, and that's about 20 years old now. And it's used for education. It's not publicly open, but they do open days. But that's a really great example of a forest garden, both on a roof and in not much soil, and in a small space. So you can see it's really sandwiched there in between 2 buildings. And of course, I couldn't mention forest gardens without mentioning Martin Crawford. I've been on all his courses. I'm a big fan. I think he's a really lovely chap, and he's very generous with his knowledge. And really, he's leading the way in terms of forest garden knowledge in this country, to my knowledge anyway. And that's a picture of him in his original forest garden, which is at the just outside the Schumacher College in outside Totnes. And just to give you a feel of, if you're not familiar with forest gardens, of what they might look like in terms of the planting layers. So you've got trees and shrubs and climbers and underplanting, and you can see just how many different plants are growing there all together. And there's no bare soil, because there's no bare soil in nature. So, you know, you may as well fill it with a plant that you want rather than a plant that you don't want. And he's famously quoted as saying that he weeds only 2 days of the year. So he does a spring weed and an autumn weed, and apart from that, the plants manage themselves. So forest gardens can be an effective landscape management tool. Certainly, if you compare it with, say, a lawn that then needs mowing regularly, particularly in public space, they can be incredibly efficient and good uses of the space, and producing so much more food than something like a lawn would anyway. So known to be low maintenance. So designed correctly, forest gardens can be really great tools, and lovely social spaces, great educational opportunities, and really efficient for crop production. So I'm a big fan of forest gardens, and I've designed quite a few in my time, and put a number in of kind of different scale. And most recently planted a 1 hectare forest garden, which is very exciting, and that's in Shropshire. And if anybody wants to hear a bit more about that, I can talk about that at the end. Now, I mentioned about a couple of case studies. One of my personal favourites. So from Canada, in Montreal, I forget this chap's name, but he's quite a character. If you look them up on YouTube, they do a lot of videos and things. He's quite a character. So he has a really nice model of sort of linear forest gardens. So sort of wavering, I guess, between orchard and forest garden, because he's got his trees planted in rows, but all of the trees are never the same tree next to each other or diagonally. as far as I understand. So you can see from this diagram, it's got Asian pear, apple, honey locust, pear, and he's got them, you know, not the same one next to each other. So he's thinking about polyculture and diversity, but then he's underplanted the trees with productive planting, so fruit shrubs, climbers, things like that, and then he undergrazes the area with birds for egg production. And as far as I understand, this is a CSA model, so the food is produced goes into boxes and shares to the members of the CSA. So I really like this model. I think it's a great example of what we could be doing. And I think for me, it shows what orchards could become. You know, I think orchards are lovely spaces, and they're obviously very historic in this country. But I think in terms of efficiency, they could offer so much more in terms of production. And you know, if you planted in rows, you could still manage it in theory with machinery if you plant at the right width. So a bit like silvo arable, if you're familiar with that as a system. But you know, you can design the tree widths for machinery. We're going to look at ponds. So this is, if anybody knows their castles, this is Bodiam Castle in Kent. Lovely old castle with a lovely moat around it. So this is the bridge across the moat into the castle. And I've used it as an example because there happen to be carp in this castle. Castle moat, sorry. And carp are not a particular delicacy, but they are an edible fish, and they're used a lot in Asian cooking, rather than in this country, perhaps. And there are ducks on this pond. And what's exciting about this system is that carp eat duck poo, which isn't a very nice thought. And then thinking about eating the fish is perhaps not such a nice thought, but in terms of a system, it's incredibly efficient because you're double using the water for 2 yields. So you could collect the eggs from the duck, you could potentially kill the ducks and eat the duck, and you can eat the fish. So in terms of food security for this castle, you know, and that's what historically was set up. But in a smaller pond, perhaps that's an idea for you know, efficient food production. So carp and duck for me is quite a nice closed loop system. And you know, there are many others that we could design around kind of birds and fish and things like that, and ponds. So on the sort of larger end of the scale then, reed bed systems. So this is from Sheepdrove Organic Farm, which is where we happen to have our demonstration market garden in Berkshire. And Sheepdrove have long had a reed bed system integrated into their landscape. It was one of the things that they set up when they took over the farm many years ago. I couldn't really find a very good picture for you, but I decided to show you this one because it shows the whole of the farm, whereas I could find a picture of a lake. But actually what's nice about this reed bed system is it processes all the waste out of the toilets from the venue, and it runs down the hillside, and there's a series of different lakes, as well as I don't know what they're called, but they're kind of stone basins, and the water cycles around them in a fast figure-of-8 motion, and that motion cleans the water as that goes. And of course it passes through a number of different lakes, and the plants and the reeds and other plants in the ponds do their biofertility job of cleaning the water, and it reaches a lake at the bottom. And by the time it reaches the lake at the bottom, it's certainly healthy to swim in. I don't know if they claim it's drinkable, but you can certainly design a reed bed system that makes the water drinkable at the end. You know, we know the power of plants, and the power of pollutant clearing from water is incredibly powerful of plants. So, you know, reed bed systems to process sewage and black water can be really effective, and there are a number of examples of that being incorporated into urban systems and urban designs of development. Quick slurp of tea. One of which is this. This is slightly contentious often when I present this. Sustainable city in Dubai. And I do put it in to be slightly provocative, because can one actually design a sustainable city in the middle of a desert? I'll leave that for you to think about. But I do think that there are a number of features in this development which are good design. Some of them are bad, but one of the things I really like about it is that down the centre they've got this green spine, and through this green spine runs a water processing stream that processes both black water and grey water. So in terms of processing waste on site, I think for me that's one of the things that's quite exciting. The biodomes that you can see are used to produce herbs and edible crops. And they, of course, have the reverse problem there. So they're trying to keep that inside space cooler rather than us trying to heat up our polytunnels, particularly at this time of year. So they have a few sort of quite nice solar powered systems that manage that and keep the biodomes cool. So it's an intentionally built development. They've incorporated the water processing, they've incorporated food production with the biodomes, but they've also done edible planting along the streets. And then they have designated electric car parks that's all solar powered. And the smaller streets around the houses are completely vehicle free. So they've intended to make that safe for children playing, etc. So for me, I think there's some nice design elements there. And yeah, like I say, I'll leave you to make your mind up about whether that can actually be a sustainable city. But yeah, I like a few of the design elements. I'll leave it there. So to summarise then, the morphological layers that we've designed food or talked about food systems from, I guess, is from buildings to plots to the street level and then up to green and blue. And I've just put some examples there of you know what those might be and what might be produced in those areas. And I said to Lizzie that I would probably need to program in some kind of comfort break. And I'm doing that now. So I'm using my credit, if you don't mind. I'll leave this screen up. And if you don't mind us just having 5 minutes for a quick comfort break. Is that all right, Lizzie?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool. But I'm back. I don't know if you're there, Lizzie, but I'm not sure if that's exactly 5 minutes. I don't want people to feel like they've been cheated out of their 5-minute break.
I think it was about 4 minutes, but yeah, I mean, I can't see that anyone's left, so
Fine. Just a quick check-in on chat or questions, anything that needs answering.
no, not yet. I think
Okay.
you're doing good. You're answering all the questions.
Okay, great. Well, I'll carry on then. So got a couple more case studies and a sort of design, conceptual design that I've done to talk to you about, and one that somebody else has done, all around kind of urban food production. So I've talked you through a number of different food production systems. I've talked about where they might happen in the urban fabric. And now I want to talk about kind of what we can do with that. You know, what might that actually look like if we started to think about designs for our urban environments? So this is a conceptual design not done by me. The Fayetteville 2030 food city scenario. You can Google it. It's all freely available on the internet. And this came up when I was in my studies, and yeah, I think it's got some interesting ideas. I'll leave you to explore it in sort of more detail in your own time, but just to highlight a couple of things. So they've created something that they've called a compost campus. And again, you know, I think for me, if I was designing this, I'd be looking at integrating all of the different systems more than having kind of silos. But I still think that it raises some interesting ideas. So, you know, within this, they've got things like food forest, vermicompost, anaerobic and aerobic composting, etc. So it's quite an interesting, you know, it looks nice. It's been presented well. They've got shelter belts, windbreaks, etc. So you know, it brings about, for me, it brings about a few questions and generates a bit of discussion. So if you're interested in sort of larger scale city planning, then that would definitely be a project worth looking up. US based, I should say. Yeah, I'm not sure if I said that. And then the other one that I really like is the integrated pond system. So I've talked a bit about, you know, ponds, and I talked about swales last time for urban water management and, you know, larger scale weed bed systems. So, you know, for me, I find this quite exciting. They've incorporated aquaculture and wetlands, aquaponics, floating gardens, etc. You know, to create a really nice space that people can enjoy, as well as it being functional and used for food production. So that's one example I always like sharing. This is a conceptual design that I did. And it was actually designed for Hong Kong. So some of the species that you'll see at the bottom there were non-native to here. So a couple of blocks of apartments and then a larger block of commercial with a rooftop garden, woodland undergrazed with productive birds, hence the eggs that are produced in this system. And then street trees, cycle paths, walking paths, pocket parks, that kind of thing. And I've listed some of the species there just for interest. So, you know, nice, interesting species that we don't really grow here. So things like camphor and candlenut. So there's, you know, all over the world, obviously, there's loads of interesting edibles. And I just wish that I could live 3 lives and go traveling around the world and learn it all. But, you know, there's never enough time, is there? But I've summarised the production that comes out of this scope. So this is 2 large urban scale blocks, essentially. And I've summarised the production. So 18,000 eggs from the birds on the roof, fruit production, veg production, nut production, and fish production from aquaponic greenhouses that sit on the rooftops of that. And again, I won't talk about it now because I think it's slightly less relevant. But if somebody's interested, I'm happy to talk about it at the end. In the commercial block, the ground floor is a cockroach farm for processing food waste. Not a very nice thought, but we need to deal with our food waste. And so if anybody's interested in that towards the end, I'll happily talk about that a bit more. But I don't want to put anyone off their dinner. So this is sort of a summary of some of the projects that I've showcased, really in varying scale. So we've got vertical veg in the bottom left, which is balcony scale, right up to the larger sustainable city. And I've tried to give you different examples of different food production systems, but also different environmental benefits, economic benefits, and social benefits. And so hopefully I've done that, and I've got you thinking about kind of what could food production look like in the future, or what could our sustainable food future look like. And certainly for me, that includes some kind of indoor space. So again, I included some of these last time when we were looking at sort of buildings and plot scale. So we've got things like gardens in London, Sky Garden, Canary Wharf Rooftop Garden, Eden Project, of course. Can not talk about it really, because being inside their Mediterranean and tropical biomes, for me as a plant person and an edible plant person, it's really interesting to see how other food crops grow, because we don't really get to see it unless we get to see it on the telly or we go there. So I think it does show how we could be looking at growing some of our foods here. And whilst I'm not really into high energy systems, so I'm not a fan of vertical farms, for example, because I think it's so far removed from actual food production in soil, using the sun. I'm sure with technology now, with renewable technology and energy sources, there are ways that we could sustainably manage indoor growing spaces that can be heated for this country, in order that we can produce more of the crops that we're currently importing. I mean, I don't know the current statistic actually, and I'd be interested if somebody does know the current statistic of exactly the proportion of our food that we do import. But as I've said, in previous times, Victorian walled garden times, dig for victory times, not that I'm suggesting we ever want to go back to that situation of war, but in extreme times, we have shown that we can produce so much more food in this country. And that's certainly something that I would aspire to. And economically as well, because we could be creating so many more jobs around food growing and food production. And, as I say, I know I don't need to convince this particular audience here tonight. But the bottom right is a picture from Martin Crawford's greenhouse, which is heated. But he's such a clever chap, and he's designed it entirely to be renewable. So he's designed it with using solar energy and solar power, exchange heat systems. He's got a bank of IBCs full of water on the south-facing wall that can absorb that heat and then release it overnight. So there definitely are ways that we can design indoor growing spaces in order to support our food production in our urban spaces. And I have done a design for Oxford. I lived in Oxford for many years. I happen to live just outside it now, but I know it very well. I know the green spaces very well. So I thought, why don't I play around with what could we produce inside the ring road, for anyone that knows Oxford. So anything that sits inside that ring road as a sort of area. What if we started to incorporate some edible gardens and some biomes for food production? So I started to point on the map all of the green spaces that I thought were big enough to hold some food production. I'm not suggesting that we get rid of all of the green space. It's needed for recreation, dog walking, etc. So this is really using a tiny portion of green space available. But if you know Oxford, you'll know there are some huge spaces like South Park, Port Meadow, etc., which could afford to lose a small amount of land to food production. And I've also incorporated schools, because quite often schools will have space for something like an aquaponic greenhouse or a biome or some kind of small scale production, maybe an orchard or a small forest garden, etc. Again, I'm not suggesting that we put over all of our school fields to food, but maybe a portion. So the total of this design incorporates 300, just nearly 300,500 square meters, to give you some idea of area. So what if we started to incorporate some kind of edible forest garden? So I guess I've taken inspiration from many sources for this, such as the Canadian one that I showed you, Martin Crawford, etc. And I've adapted it to what I think might work. And we designed the rows maybe to be underplanted for crops that would be ready for each month of the year. So we were thinking about, using it a bit like a supermarket system where we could go up and down the aisles, and, crops are ready at different times of the year, perhaps. I've put sweet chestnut trees in for obviously the nut production, great for energy, great for protein source. You can make a flour out of it as well. So I think sweet chestnuts offer us a lot. And then I've incorporated some water in the middle there that you'll see, and that's really to support some of the undergrazing birds. So I'd be putting egg-producing birds undergrazing that. As much for production as for being the grass cutters in between the rows, because you'd want the rows to be wide enough for people, pushchairs, prams, wheelchairs, etc., to be able to move up and down, and probably some bird housing as well. And then, of course, around the outside, we'd have some kind of edible hedge. And I'd incorporate lots of the edibles that we might know, and some maybe slightly more unusual ones. So fuchsia berries are edible. If you're ever lucky enough to get one pollinated, I think they taste really nice. They taste a bit like a cherry plum, and they can be made into puddings or whatever. But in this country, where it's fairly unlikely that they produce berries. So you might be lucky to get a handful off a shrub. So I've put them in sort of to scale, as to what that might look like. So this is what I've called a full-size garden. So that's kind of the proportion of a park that it would take up. So tiny part of it, and because the park is larger, it could potentially hold an aquaponic greenhouse / biodome as well. And then a half garden to scale might look something like this. So it is taking up a decent portion of that land, maybe a quarter, maybe between a fifth and a quarter of that recreational ground. So this is more like a sort of, I say pocket park, but actually for Oxford, it's still quite a large park. And so, taking away some of that space and using it for one of the edible food gardens. And to recap, 300,000 square meters, apologies, could produce, from my calculations and from my experience of yield calculation, 21% of Oxford's fruit and veg needs, and that's not including supporting crops, so things like eggs, mushrooms, nuts. So that's just using the kind of the rows of the garden itself, and that's not including anything that might come from the streetscape. So things like silviculture, street trees, raised beds on streets, a la Incredible Edible, Todmorden, so things like that. So that's not including that crop. So I think, in my opinion, it'd be very easy to double that to something like 42%, which is nearly half of the produce needed. So there are many, many different things that we could be doing to produce food in our cities. And I guess my question really is, why aren't we doing more? Because it's just a win-win. And when you look at the impact that Incredible Edibles had on Todmorden, and I'm sure lots of other places, it's just that Todmorden's the place that I know best. The positive impacts of bringing people together, of learning about food, of producing food locally and generating a real value for local food, generating jobs, keeping money within the local economy. There really isn't an argument against it, except that, of course, we're battling against the supermarkets, which of course is the crux of our food system at present. So there we have it. That is our whistle-stop tour of urban food production. I've done sort of two and a bit hours, I guess, talking about this, and I honestly could just keep talking about it all day, but I won't. We've all got evenings to have. So I'll draw a line under it, and I'll just open it up for questions if people want to ask anything. I'm happy to expand on anything that I've touched on, and I'll put our socials up.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Rachel. There aren't currently any questions in the Q&A box, but I do have a couple. Maybe you can expand. I'd love to, if nobody minds, I'd love to hear about the cockroaches. I think you touched on it last time, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. And then also maybe a question around obviously I don't expect you to have the answer, and I think it's a much bigger problem that we all need to that we're all constantly, as organic growers and as small scale growers, trying to solve
Yeah.
and tackle. But the this issue around like the potential to produce food, but not necessarily having the markets to to buy it. And I'm just kind of thinking of it was amazing to hear, you know, how much what percentage of fruit you could produce in a small city like Oxford, of Oxford's fruit needs. But you know, I'm just wondering if the fruit that we do buy is, you know, the very kind of standard apple, pears, and bananas kind of thing, and how much what we could do to kind of, and obviously you're all about education, but what we could do to kind of increase people's awareness of different types of food. And yeah, like you said, you had a cup of acorn coffee and things like that. And so yeah, maybe those two questions could be expanded upon.
Yeah, sure. I'll do them in the order in which you asked them. So yeah, the cockroaches. So cockroaches are incredibly effective at consuming our food waste. And of course, in some countries, cockroaches are consumed as a food product by humans. We're not quite there yet in this country, and I'm not sure how I feel about it. But that aside, cockroaches themselves could be a food source, and or they could be fed to chickens, as an example. I'm sure there are other sort of animal combinations, but chickens is one that I know of. So they're a food source, a protein source to chickens. They've already consumed the food waste, so they're managing our food waste issue. And we're turning our food waste essentially then back into food. So either through eating the cockroaches or through consuming the chickens or other animals that they're being fed to. So they're very efficient creatures in terms of devouring our food waste. And so in China, particularly is where I know of it as an example, but I'm sure it happens elsewhere as well. There are big sort of cockroach factories, if you like, or warehouses, or whatever you want to call it, big buildings, where the food waste trucks come in to sort of, you know, underground, dump off the food waste out of the truck. And I know all of the cockroaches are, of course, kept securely inside the building because you don't want them running amok. So you need to make sure that the building is entirely secure. And in the design that I did for Hong Kong, I put a water moat around the outside of the building intentionally, so that if any cockroaches then escaped, they ended up in the water. So that was intentional design, and also there were carp living in that in that ditch. And I think maybe I talked about it last time, but carp eat food waste as well. And there's places in Japan and other places where water channels exist around the urban or town landscape, and carp live in them. The waterways pass through people's houses and kitchens, so they can throw their food waste directly into the stream, and the carp eat it. So you're dealing with your food waste then and there, and of course, you know, carp are eaten in some areas. So a really, really efficient way of managing food waste through those different systems. And of course, you're turning food waste back into food. Hopefully that's good on that one. And then the other question, so I mean, I think that Todmorden have done a lot of really great things that we can think about replicating. Again, other places as well, but to use a couple of examples that they've used, it's about, I think the answer for me is kind of two main things. One, something they did really well was get food growing in front of everybody's face. It's a smaller place, you know, Todmorden compared with Oxford, it's tiny. So yeah, there are sort of things that need dealing with there, but raised beds on every street corner, at the train station, at the police station, at the fire station, labelled up as incredible edible. This is what food growing looks like. You just can't avoid food growing in that town. You just can't get away from it, you know, like it or love it, like it or hate it. Food growing at the high school, they've got food growing into every single school across the town, primary and secondary. So the children learn about food production. So you really can't avoid it. So the children are getting that education right from day one. And the adults are getting their children coming home saying, we learned about this food production today, can we try growing this at home this year? So you really can't get away from it. So that's one thing. It's having it in front of people's faces. You know, we're so separated now with our lives from food. I mean, we're not on this call, but you know, generally the population is so separated from food production. They really don't understand what needs to go into it. So having that food growing very visibly, I think, is a key part of that. And the other part is generating a value around local food. And something that they did in Tottenham, I can't remember if I talked about it last time, so apologies if I did, but Incredible Edible got some chalkboards branded up, Incredible Edible Todmorden, gave the chalkboards to all of the stall holders at the local market. So the town holds a market regularly, many days of the week, and said, excuse me, if you're selling any local produce, please list it on this board so that people know they can come to you and buy local produce. And so all of a sudden you've got, you know, the meat stall selling local sausages and the cheese stalls are selling local cheese. And then you've got producers popping up saying, actually, yeah, I might start keeping pigs up on the hillside and selling my sausages through the meat stall at the market. And therefore that money's then staying completely in that local economy. There's a cheese maker that's set up making a Todmorden made cheese. One of the ladies involved in Incredible Edible has started taking the honey from the beehives in the churchyard in Todmorden to make honey ice cream that then is sold locally. So, you know, it all impacts in so many different ways. But now in Todmorden, what happens is people want to be buying local. They've completely shifted that. And actually, I mean, it's been going, I think, probably now for 20 plus years, the project, but very quickly, actually, it's just shifted the mindset, you know, sooner than 20 years. And in the history of humans, when you think about that kind of mind shift change, that's quite impressive. Again, you know, we're talking about a small town. It's not Oxford. It doesn't have a million things happening every night competing with people's time and, you know, etc. There are differences there. But I think there's a lot we can learn from it as well. And I think, you know, yeah, the potential for making a place important for food production is incredible. There's a lot of potential.
Thank you for answering those so well. There's one question in the chat from Amanda. What would be the best thing to do with food waste in a college campus which has nothing set up as present?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be looking at bokashi. Bokashi is it's Japanese for fermenting. So it's a fermenting process. And bokashi can deal with all food waste. So absolutely everything: dairy, bread, citrus, meat, bones, fish, etc. So you know, it's different from other composting methods. But setting up some kind of bokashi system, because then the waste from a bokashi system can be incorporated into a standard composting process. So yeah, I mean, again, food waste is such an underused product, really, in this country. We don't value it. And it could and again, you know, I'm sure everyone on this call does, but you know, obviously I'm talking about people outside of this call.
Brilliant. There's no other questions in the Q&A box or the chat. So yeah, I think that was there. You did a really good job of. I had a load of questions, but you already answered them. So yeah, thank you again, Rachel. That was really interesting. And yeah, like I said in the previous webinar that Rachel did, I think it's a often overlooked area of the organic world, is kind of urban and peri-urban food growing. I think it's, you know, mainly focused on kind of like you said at the beginning, people who have access to, you know, 2 to 5, even 10 acres, particularly, you know, when we're speaking about horticulture, and that's just not accessible to everyone. And there's, you know, the high population, high density population in cities. So yeah, it's something that's really overlooked. And yeah, so just really grateful for you for having taken this time to talk to us about it. And yeah, if anyone does have any other questions, then send them to me. I'll put my email in the chat, and yeah, we can try and, I don't know, figure some way of answering them, or yeah, contact Rachel at Edge, and yeah, hopefully you can all go and start your own food growing projects in the city.
Yeah, very happy to. Yeah, I'm not going anywhere. So if people do think of questions or questions pop up, yeah, feel free to ping them over, or yeah, we're on all the socials, so you can always find us and pop us a question, or go via Lizzie, that's fine. Yeah, just interested to see if people sort of get inspired by any of it, or contribute this to their current town or city, and get things going. It'd be really interesting to see what happens. And we all know food security is non-existent at the moment, so we need to be doing things, lots of things, to be changing our food system. And this for me feels like something that is kind of achievable. And Todmorden showed that it's just about the community getting behind you. So just talking to the right people, having a reliable group of people that can make something happen, and quite quickly you can be changing around your town or city.
Yeah, absolutely. Vital work. So yeah. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Yeah, make sure you check out our other events, and hope you have a very lovely rest of your evening. Good luck with your growing projects wherever you are. Yeah, I'll stop the recording now.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for coming, and hopefully it was interesting.